The 1938 Schmeling fight was my father's most famous fight. It really foisted him from being a black heavyweight champion to a true American hero. He allowed white America to think of blacks in a different context.
Joe Louis Barrow Jr. Today on Now I've Heard Everything. I'm Bill Thompson. It was 1938, the eve of the outbreak of World War II. And a 24-year-old American boxer, the son of sharecroppers from Alabama, was about to alter the course of our history. That young man was Joe Louis, full name Joe Louis Barrow, but better known by his nickname, the Brown Bomber. It was on June 22nd, 1938, that Joe Louis took on German boxer Max Schmeling. Now, Schmeling had won their first match in 1936, and this rematch was widely anticipated. This one was all Joe Louis. He knocked out Schmeling in the first round. And along the way, according to his son, Joe Louis Barrow Jr., this transformed the way America looked at African Americans. And that is why Barrow Jr. called his 1988 book about his father, Joe Louis, 50 Years an American Hero. I met him when he was on a book tour that fall. In just a moment, our conversation.
Come back with us now as we relive a little piece of our cultural history on Now I've Heard Everything. This interview is from Bill Thompson's 30-year archive. Enjoy.
So here now, from 1988, Joe Louis Barrow Jr.
His real name was Joe Louis Barrow. And now people for years didn't realize that I was Joe Louis's son because I was not going by Joe Louis Jr. But the realities are that when he first started boxing, he eliminated the barrow. The common story is that he was afraid that his mother would find out that he was using his violin lesson money for boxing lessons versus violin lessons, but that's not the real reason. The real reason is that when he started boxing, well, maybe I'll let people read the book.
I love it. I love it.
But the real reason of why he uses Joe Louis is in my book.
Do you remember the very first time you realized your dad was somebody famous?
Well, I went to school at the University of Chicago Lab School, which is a private school in Chicago, and there were 5 of us who were black in the school, and it always intrigued me of why the white parents would always come up to me and say, your father was very, very special. He was a tremendous American. And that was when I was in 7th, 8th grade, 5th, 6th, 7th grade. And then in high school and in college it continued, and that's when I really started to focus that my father was very special. We'd go out to restaurants when I was a youngster because I grew up with my mother and my stepfather because my parents were divorced. And when I would go to those infrequent dinners, it always bothered me that I had to share my father with the entire restaurant. But that's when I knew that he was something more than just Dad.
Why did you decide to write the book right now?
Well, history was taking its toll, and I really wanted to rekindle the flame of Joe Louis. That I had heard all these years of the impact that he'd made, the difference he'd made in so many people's lives, the emotion, the inspiration that he'd provided. And that with the 50th anniversary of the Max Schmeling fight being this year, that this was a time to perhaps release the book because people like to celebrate 50th anniversaries. And clearly, the 1938 Schmeling fight was my father's most famous fight. It really foisted him from being a black heavyweight champion to a true American hero because he was embraced by so many whites throughout the country because of the political aura. A lot of people said that that fight was the preamble to World War II, and that my father's defeat of Max was a signal to the Germans that they weren't going to win.
Very symbolic in retrospect.
It was very symbolic, and it was Nazi Germany, the Aryan race, the supremacy of the world. And ironically, here was a black man carrying the flag of democracy in a very segregated United States. And he had started in humble beginnings as a sharecroppers family in Chambers County, Alabama, to the ghettos of Detroit. And all of a sudden, here was a black American holding up and defending the flag of freedom when he couldn't experience all those freedoms on a daily basis.
And there were no Jesse Jacksons back then. There were no Ralph Abernathys.
There really weren't. And a lot of people criticized my father later in life in the 60s for not being more vocal, not being the Jesse Jacksons, the Martin Luther Kings, the Whitney Youngs. But the realities are that my father, I think, started it. I mean, I think because of the love that the entire country embraced and the endearment that they had for my father, he allowed white America to think of blacks in a different context. And he was on all of the major newspapers. He was in the movie newsreels. And all of a sudden, here was a black man who was a patriot. I mean, he volunteered for the Army. He donated 2 of his championship purses to the Navy and Army relief funds, conducted 96 exhibitions. And for the first time, white America, I think, was thinking about blacks in a different context. And that started the movement, because he also gave tremendous hope to blacks who prior to my father were relegated to very menial jobs and menial tasks. But he gave them the desire to go that extra step.
Did he realize that at the time?
I think so. I think he realized that he was very important to blacks. I think he realized that he was very famous and that he was an emotional lift. When he walked along the streets of Chicago or Detroit in the black areas, I mean, people would come out of the restaurants, come out of their homes to even look at Joe Louis, much less if they had an opportunity to shake his hand. And yes, I think he realized that he was an important figure, and he did it with a lot of humility and grace and dignity, and I think that's what distinguished him in the minds of many of his fans, that he was so graceful as he approached the championship.
There's quite a burden that goes along with that, though, isn't there? You feel as though you have to live up to somebody else's standards.
Well, but the interesting thing is that even though the standards were tough, and the problem is that my father was living with the legacy of Jack Johnson, who was the first black heavyweight champion in the early 1900s, who flaunted his victories, who jeered at the whites, who really did not endear himself at all to this country, to white America. He was still a champion, Jack Johnson was, to black America, because he was the hope. I mean, he achieved a special crown, if you will. But my father came from a very religious background. He went to church on Sundays 2 or 3 times. He had a very disciplined family environment. His mother, they knew right and wrong. In fact, my aunt told me that they never got punished for doing something wrong. They got punished for lying about it. And that was the environment that Joe Louis grew up in. He grew up in a very, very strict, disciplined environment. And he would have been successful in anything he would have attempted to do because he had the family support, the foundation. And so my book is really not just a book about a boxer. It's a book about an American and where he came from, what he did. The person of Joe Louis is what I try and accomplish in my book, because it's the person that touched so many people.
You also have some fantastic pictures in here. I mean,
yes.
I'm going to show them on the radio.
That's right. Well, you know, it's very interesting you say that, Bill, because many people say that they saw so many Joe Louis fights as they listened to him on the radio. I mean, radio played such an important role in those days because everyone huddled around those radios. And the pictures that are in the book range from when he was some of the boxing pictures to some pictures of myself and my dad when I was young, to some very endearing pictures of my father and Max Schmeling in 1966 in Hamburg. I went over to Germany and interviewed Max for the book, and it was a very emotional interview. It was very special in the sense that they had a camaraderie, a friendship that you don't experience between fighters. Both Billy Conn, and who fought my father in 1941 and 46, as well as Max, really loved and felt a very special rapport and relationship with Joe Louis.
I think. Do you think that people will find that surprising?
I think that people of today might find it surprising. I think that people who grew up in that era probably realized that they were more opponents. I think a lot of people will be very surprised to know that Joe Louis and Max Schmeling were indeed very good friends, and that Max came over, I know for a fact, on 4 occasions to attend tributes to my father because he loved him so much.
But you know, that's the way true athletes are, aren't they?
Right.
I mean, you can beat somebody in the ring or on the diamond or on the court or on the gridiron or whatever, but they know that they've been beaten by a good, worthy opponent.
That's right. And they were professionals, and then they walk out of it and they move on. And the boxing game was so visible then that they enjoyed the camaraderie. Billy Conn saw my father 6 months after the 1941 fight, and he walked up to my dad and says, "Joe, How come you didn't let me win that fight? I could have held the championship for 6 months. I could have gone to all the bars in Pittsburgh and said, I'm the heavyweight champion. My father looks at him and says, Billy, you had the title for 12 rounds. You couldn't hold it for 13. What makes you think you can hold it for 6 months?
After this short break, Joe Louis Barrow has more about the impact his father had on America.
Are you finding this interview engaging? Curious about the book we're discussing?
Simply click the link in our show notes or visit our website heardeverything.com to get your copy.
When you shop through our affiliate links, you're not only enjoying great content, but also supporting this podcast.
Thank you for your support.
Now back to my 1988 conversation with Joe Louis Barrow Jr.
You know, it's too bad today. A lot of people have the impression that boxers just don't have what it takes up here to make it in any other profession. So they go into a profession where all they have to do is bash each other in the face or in the stomach for 10 or 12 rounds. So that is certainly not true of all boxers now, is it?
No, it isn't. And a lot of people like to say that about my dad because he died very humbly. I mean, that he literally gave his money away. I mean, if you were to walk up to Joe Louis on the street and ask him for $10, he'd give you 20. I mean, he was very generous. People would borrow money to establish businesses. He grew up, as I said, in that family background, and my uncle described it probably the best in the book when he said that he would make $12 a week. He would give $6 to his mother, put $4 in the Bible, and live off the other $2. That was the sharing that Joe Louis. Joe Louis was asked what was the most important event in his life, and he said to see his sister Eunice graduate from Howard University, not one of his fights. And he was one of his greatest disappointments was when my aunt didn't go on to get her PhD. That's the Joe Louis being, the human being. And there was a story once where a gentleman called up and he said, I was one of the kids who used to ring the pots and pans. And I said, well, how did you feel? And he said, I grew up in Pittsburgh and I was slated to work in the steel mills, but I am a college dean today because I could aspire to much broader things because your father gave me the inspiration that I could do more than what was expected of me. That's what Joe Louis was about.
Wow. And all the celebrity friends that he had.
Oh, yeah. I mean, one of the greatest interviews on my book was when I went to Bob Hope's house. That house is outrageous. And Bob is a very special friend of my father. He attended a lot of the fights, and that was a very fun visit. But another special interview was here in Washington, D.C. with John Thompson, coach at Georgetown. John said that he doesn't think he would have ever won an NCAA championship had it not been for Joe Louis, because Joe Louis inspired him to be the best. I asked John, I said, when did you learn of Joe Louis? He says, I don't know when I didn't know of Joe Louis, because his parents always told him about Joe Louis and to aspire to be the best and to have the grace and dignity as my father did.
And it occurred to me when you were talking a few minutes ago about the 38 fight, and I can't remember, you could probably tell me the name of the announcer that we always hear in all the sports highlights, the radio sports highlights, Don
Dunphy.
There you go.
The voice of radio.
And, that is probably one reason that fight has become so famous is because his call.
Well, actually, the 38 fight was done by Clem McCarthy. Don Dunphy didn't come in until 1941 with the Billy Conn fight. But Clem McCarthy is the infamous voice in the 1938 fight. In fact, interestingly enough, when Don Dunphy called the Joe Louis Billy Conn fight in 1941, that was his first fight. And so my father, and Don Dunphy, when I interviewed him, always recalls the story. When my father was approaching the ring, he walked up to Don Dunphy and he says, good luck tonight. I know it's an important fight for you. And even as he was approaching, he knew that it was Don Dunphy's first major radio call, and he had the compassion to say, Don, good luck to you. And Don Dunphy remembers that to this very hour.
Do you think today's boxers live up to the kinds of professional standards that your father said?
I know that a lot of fighters, and I've talked to Michael Spinks, I've talked to Sugar Ray Leonard, Muhammad Ali, a lot of them used my father as their guide. And they aspire to be as well recognized and to have the kind of impact that my father did. Whether they all have lived up to it, I think is, to be debated. I think Muhammad Ali was a very important force. I think clearly Michael Spinks was not a reigning heavyweight for a long time, but he certainly held it with his, dignity. And of course, Sugar Ray Leonard was a very special person. Now, my father touched a lot of professional boxers, and a lot of them felt that if they could touch the country half as much as Joe Louis did, then it would be special.
Are there times when it's difficult for you to be the son of a celebrity?
Not really. I mean, frankly, now having completed the book and having worked on it for 2.5 years and talked to so many people around the country and the world, I feel tremendous pride. And I'm very privileged to be Joe Louis's son. So, unlike before, when I was living the life of Joe Barrow, working in a bank or working for the Department of Energy in Washington, I take great pride now when people ask me about my father. I want to tell the stories of Joe Louis, because Joe Louis did make the difference for a generation of people. Not a difference, but the difference. And we're, I think, a better country because of it, because he inspired people to excel to greater heights than perhaps they were expected to. That's what Joe Louis is about. I mean, he's a very special human being who really was humble. He was gracious. He was loved, he was sharing, and he cared about a lot of people. There was a gentleman who called me on one show, and he said, I'll tell you when Joe Louis meant, a lot to me. And he said very simply that when I was in the concentration camps, I was there for 4 and 5 years. And I held on because I knew that the Germans were not invincible because Joe Louis beat Max Schmeling. He says, I survived those camps. I'm Polish and I'm a Jew. And my father died in those camps, and I want to believe that he died thinking he could beat them because Joe Louis beat him. That's what Joe Louis meant to us. I'm here today because I knew that the Germans, someday somebody would beat him because your father beat Max. And that story and the story that I told about the black man who was not a steel worker but a dean of a college epitomizes who Joe Louis. And we don't have heroes like that anymore. We don't have people that can impact the world the way my father did. And we've got to sort of rekindle those flames, because with those memories and with those thoughts, the next generation can say we can do what we want to do and we can be as successful as we'd like to be.
Joe Louis died in 1981 at age 66. Max Schmeling helped pay for his funeral, and Joe Louis is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Now you can get your copy of Joe Louis, 50 Years an American Hero by Joe Louis Barrow Jr. by tapping the link in our show notes, by clicking the link in the description below if you're listening to this on YouTube, or by going to our website, heardeverything.com. We may earn an Amazon commission if you make a purchase. HeardEverything.com is where you can also hear my 2003 conversation with boxer George Foreman.
Even Muhammad Ali, I met him as a youngster, just starting off in boxing. He walked up to me, he said, keep punching, champ. You're going to be champion of the world, George. Of course, later on I learned to hate him.
And my conversation with another sports hero, a different sport, but every bit the hero, my 1988 talk with Willie Mays.
I didn't want to be just a ball player. I didn't want to be just a guy every day go out and do the same thing other guys did. I tried to create things. One of those was the hat, the basket catch.
And of course, we post new episodes of Now I've Heard Everything every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and you can find us everywhere you listen to podcasts. And thank you so much for listening. Next time on Now I've Heard Everything, a conversation with one of America's favorite traveling troubadours, a comedian, ventriloquist, musician who's entertained audiences for 4 decades. My 2025 interview, yes, one of my fresh new interviews with Taylor Mason.
For the most part, having a ventriloquist puppet on your arm and trying to do a dramatic reading of, Macbeth is probably not going to work.
I cannot remember ever seeing a Shakespearean ventriloquist.
Those are 2 words that have never been put together before.
That's next time on Now I've Heard Everything. I'm Bill Thompson.